everyone, welcome. Feel free to go ahead and start introducing yourselves in the chat as you're coming in from the waiting room. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Welcome everyone. Again, feel free to go ahead and start introducing yourselves. You can type your name and where you're calling in from in the chat. I see Joylitha. Hi, Joylitha. I see Carrie from Minnesota. I see Julian, Storm from Virginia. I see Farah. Shinwen from Georgia. Gregory from Houston. Lisa from Michigan. Coming in pretty fast, so I apologize if I miss you. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Still seeing a flow in from the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and give it another 30 seconds or so before getting started. All right, I think we've got a good group here. Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the project, apologies for, I lost my voice a little bit. I'm the project manager of the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. It's actually the 13th webinar in our series, and the topic today is knowing your rights, voter protection during election season. So feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat as we're getting started. We can go to the next slide. As we all know, housing and homelessness organizations have a really important role to play in voter protection, ensuring that every voter's right to vote is respected and their ballot is counted. This webinar will focus on resources and creative strategies that you can all employ to ensure that voters know their rights and can overcome obstacles to make their voices heard. Today's webinar will feature Nicole Burns, the founder of Patient Voting, Amira Noman, the executive director of Pizza to the Polls, and Camilla Factory, senior national coordinator for election protection at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Before we get started, we'll just have a few housekeeping items. We can go to the next slide. So as always, this webinar is being recorded. We'll distribute the recording and the links in this week's edition of our Friday email newsletter, The Connection, and the recording will be posted on the NLIHC YouTube channel by the end of the week. We also have closed captioning enabled as always. Thank you so much to our captioner for being here today. Please go ahead and ask questions using the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. I know we have a lot of people attending and it can be hard to catch questions in the chat, so we're more likely to notice them in the Q&A. Speaking of the chat, we ask that everyone engage thoughtfully and respectfully in the chat and to live by the platinum rule, which is to treat others the way they want to be treated, even if that's different from the way that you want to be treated. And last but not least, I'll leave you all with a reminder that Our Homes, Our Votes is 100% nonpartisan, meaning that we don't endorse or favor specific candidates or political parties. Our goal is to build the voting power of low-income renters so we can hold all elected officials accountable to prioritizing housing justice. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Camilla, to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for having the Lawyers Committee today. My name is Camilla Factory, pronoun she, her. I am a senior national coordinator of election protection with the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I work on election protection specifically in Texas and Arizona, but I also spearhead our national voting rights campaign, Oho Ashe, Black women answering the call. So excited to get into the Lawyers Committee, what we do, and what election protection is. This is a resource that everyone can use. Lawyers Committee, we also are a nonpartisan organization. So, our major goal is to ensure that voters have an opportunity to cast their ballot and their vote safely, and that they feel supported in doing so. So, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, who are we, right? The name is a bit prestigious. We do have an awesome history, but really, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is a nonprofit voting rights organization comprised of attorneys and organizers like myself who are fighting for voting rights litigation across the country and ensuring that our elections are protected. So we emerged out of the civil rights movement. John F. Kennedy actually founded the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law when he saw the need for the future of voting rights to be protected. That was when the organization was born. We are comprised of, like I said, civil rights attorneys and national coordinators, and we are the national convener of Election Protection Hotline, 866 Our Vote. If you haven't heard of 866 Our Vote before today, I'm so excited to share this resource with you all, considering the reason that we're convened for this call. This is a resource that voters can tap into 365 days a year, which the Lawyers Committee is blessed to convene. And finally, we partner with fund state-led efforts for election protection respective to their coalitions. So we facilitate working groups and steering committees all geared towards making sure that election protection is funded and utilized in our national network of on-the-ground organizations across the country. All right, so what is election protection? I'm excited to get into that because it sounds pretty straightforward, but I like to call election protection sort of an ant farm of folks who are dedicated to preserving the future of our democracy, ensuring that voters have a awesome experience when they go to cast their ballot. We understand at the Lawyers Committee, voting is a very sacred act of civic engagement and engaging with our democracy. And so we believe that elections are something to be protected and upheld by folks who really want to get into this work and protect our communities. Next slide, please. So election protection essentially is the largest nonpartisan voter protection program in the country. So we have 300 plus participating diverse organizations. Like I said, we really pride ourselves in partnering with organizations whose boots are on the ground, who are in the weeds of this work, who represent their marginalized communities and really want to make sure that they have a wonderful experience before, after, and during election day. So we also have thousands of volunteers for the hotline, which I mentioned before, 866 Our Vote, social media monitoring programs as well to ensure that election disinformation is not being facilitated and that voters have a streamlined, active communication with factual based directions depending on your state and local municipality. And finally, we have field programs, right? Field work is extremely important to the future of election protection and organizing. And we want to ensure that voters have that experience in the field and that our volunteers have that experience in the field because mass mobilization is what makes our program drive. So what we do, like I said, we ensure that all voters can cast a ballot freely, fairly, and securely. We empower and support voters in communities who have been historically disenfranchised and underrepresented in democracy. I am calling in from the grand old state of Texas. I am a born and raised Texan. So this work is actually really personal for me. Texas, as you all know, has been a blueprint for oppressive legislation for voters. Obstacles and barriers to voting, like Senate Bill 1, have made it extremely hard for voters to cast their ballot in disenfranchised communities. We have seen a lot of voter intimidation at the polls, and even before voters get to the polls. So, growing up as a Texan, it's really important for me to make sure that election protection is heard about, that it is supported, and that it's widely broadcasted across the country, because I never ever want to see the voter suppression that I have grown up witnessing in Texas continue to spread across the country. Next slide, please. So our election protection steering committee are comprised of the organizations that you see here: Verified Voting, State Voices, Common Cause, the NAACP, and National Disability Rights Network. These organizations are core stakeholders in ensuring that election protection as a national entity is upheld and protected. The organizations that you also see here have an amazing history of making sure that they fight alongside us in the fight for voting rights and ensuring that election protection lives on. So 866 Our Vote, so excited to talk about it. So 866 Our Vote is our national hotline. Voters can contact this, like I said, 365 days a year, to ask questions about the voting process or to report problems at the polls. What's really cool about 866 Our Vote is that you can call, text, even Facebook Messenger if you have any questions or any experiences that you feel need reporting at the polls. So we have a national network of trained legal volunteers to man the hotline and support people at any stage in the voting process. When I say legal volunteers, that means we have a network of attorneys that are specialized in local state legislation to ensure that activities that are occurring at the polls are legal and within state guidelines to protect voters as they cast their ballot. There are more severe issues or calls that indicate systemic issues and that are escalated to our state partners or command centers. So, like I said, if you can think of an ant farm, right? There are many compartments to an ant farm. In each state on election day and early voting, we have something called command centers where our partners who are in the field all convene in person and virtually. And we also have legal volunteers, like I said, those attorneys that are also present in the room. And we're actively looking at tickets. So tickets are reports, real-time reports across the country of calls that are coming into the hotline that might warn us, like I said, of voter disinformation that's being spread to steer voters away from making it to a polling location on time. I mean, we've seen everything from, election workers who are participating in partisan conduct, right? That is illegal in a lot of states. So this hotline is a way for us to document these reports in real time, but not only document these reports, follow up with the voter. So if a voter calls and they have a concern or a question, we have a network of volunteers that document this response, call the voter back, and check back in with that information or ensure that that voter made it out of an intimidating situation safely. So we are like I said, national network of nonpartisan volunteers who are not there on behalf of any candidate or party, who are ensuring that voters have access to the hotline, but also have access to pertinent information like when their polling location might close, what other polling locations that they might need. Next slide. So hotline operation. So a voter would call in. So this is how it works. People are like, what does a hotline look like? What does that mean? How does that work? And this is a very broad overview. Like I said, there are a lot of tools in this toolbox of election protection, but here's a general consensus. So a voter would call in, and a hotline volunteer would take that call. So like I said, we have volunteers waiting for voters to make these calls. Then the hotline volunteer would write that ticket down and create a ticket, right, about the voter's concern or their experience at a polling place, or even a question that they might have. From there, a trained legal volunteer will document how the voter received access in our Vote Live, which is the database of the tickets that we take in real-time reports. So our attorneys will make sure that this ticket is saw through and that this voter has access to the correct information. And then step four, the outcome of the ticket, right? This decides on what the caller is calling in about, whether that be voter intimidation, whether that be a question, or that just be a roadblock or a barrier that they may have found. A common issue that we see in Texas is polling locations closing earlier than they were promoted right on the county's website. Even down to voters who are being purged from voting lists. These are real time scenarios and dilemmas that we see. I specifically can give an example of Harris County. I'm not sure of how many folks have heard of Harris County, which is a county in Texas. There were a number of voters that were purged from Black and brown zip codes, right? What do we know about Black and brown zip codes historically? We know that Black and brown zip codes are comprised of elderly voters, right? We know that Black and brown zip codes also are comprised of voters with lower income, right? So taking these real-time reports gives us access to very valuable data that we can then flag for the state, and we can flag even for the government, right? And say, hey, there are serious concerns about exactly where voters are being disenfranchised and exactly how voters are experiencing being purged from voter lists. I can tell you right now, we see a higher percentage of voters being purged from zip codes that are lower income than we see in wealthier zip codes, right? And that's an issue. So our hotline operation is a direct, necessary correlation to data that we can then follow up on to represent our communities and ensure that we all have a fair, safe, and secure shot at casting our ballot. Next slide, please. What's also really cool is, in the name of accessibility, we understand that this nation is extremely diverse. And that's exactly why we get to call America a democracy. So we have different language lines, right? We partner with different organizations nationally to ensure that language is not a barrier when it comes to casting your vote and seeking information or reporting an issue at the polling place. So we have a Spanish hotline, an Asian hotline, as well as an Arabic hotline. We understand that a multi-racial democracy is a multi-language democracy. So we are so grateful to our partners that partner with us to help us man this hotline and ensure that voters have access in the language that they speak. Next slide, please. So those are the hotline for the different languages. And I also will report that in 2020, which was a very pivotal year for a lot of us, we saw 200,000 plus calls received to 866 Our Vote, which is a huge deal, right? That means that there were a lot of voters very likely calling in with real reports of discrimination at the polls, or even lack thereof of access in their state. So 200,000 plus calls means that we likely could see that number double for the 2024 election. So as you all know, and I'm sure you all are busy gearing up for the general, which is less than a month away. So yeah, super excited. Please call into these hotlines, and I'm sure that they will share information about these hotlines after my presentation today. Next slide. How to get involved. Next slide, please. So we have grassroots field programs in the green states that you see here. We also have general support programs in the gray states that you see. In 2020, our field programs were active in 34 states with over 40,000 volunteers at polling locations across the country. So like I said, very likely we'll see 80,000 volunteers in 2024 for this general election. Our grassroots field programs are the meat and cheese, the soul of election protection. And we could not do this work without our volunteer whose boots are on the ground in hot summer months and cold winter months, making sure that people have access to our hotline. Next slide, please. These are some examples, right? So I want to emphasize that election protection looks different in every state. Every state has the autonomy of directing and coordinating their field program according to what their voters need. So these are some examples of our outreach toolkits, a digital toolkit that we use to recruit poll monitors for the general election, and that we also let people know about deadlines that are coming up. We also have poll monitor trainings that we offer 3 times a week. So it's super important that we do this outreach and ensure that our voters are keeping up with the updates and making sure that they're registered to vote, all the good things. But most importantly, we really want to recruit as many poll monitors as possible because Texas is a huge state. But in every state, we want as many poll monitors as we can get on the ground. Next slide, please. So grassroots volunteering is awesome. These are some photos of our happy, awesome partners that partner with the Lawyers Committee. You can learn an introduction to your state's election law and rules for best practices for election protection. What's really important about our volunteers who engage with our election protection program is we discover common issues and challenges that voters face and how to solve them. Like I said, it is word of mouth, boots on the ground. Our volunteers are our communication with what is happening in real time. Interface with voters to learn about their voting problems and help remedy those problems, right? But we really like for our volunteers to help us by recruiting volunteers or even volunteering, like I said, yourself, if you're on this call and interested in becoming a poll monitor, because the more people we have, obviously, the larger the impacts that we create. I am so excited to see the data from this upcoming election. Next slide, please. Our hotline volunteers. Oh, I think. Okay. Just a real quick tidbits. Our hotline volunteers help answer live voters' questions about at any stage in the voting process, providing information and support to voters. No matter what state you are in, we have a hotline volunteer equipped with the tools and resources that you need about information to vote in your county. And also, like I said, take real-time reports of voter intimidation. If you think of an emergency hotline for an emergency, right? Think of this as a emergency hotline for voters that is active 365 days a year. You can help by telling your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers. 866 Our Vote is the number that you can call literally right now if you need to for help, because election protection is a program that I truly believe and have seen preserve the future of our democracy. But that is all from me. That is my email. Please contact me if you need any more information. And thank you all so much for having the Lawyers Committee present today on election protection.
Thank you so much, Camilla. 866 Our Vote is just such an incredible resource, and we appreciate all the work that you're doing to empower everyone to participate and make sure that our elections are accessible to all. On that note, I'm going to pass it along to Nicole from Patient Voting, who's going to discuss an aspect of protecting the vote that may not occur to a lot of people, which is what happens if you're unexpectedly hospitalized on election day and need support to cast your ballot. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Burns. I'm actually not the founder of Patient Voting, but I have been directing it for the past 2 years, and really excited to talk to you all about how patients can vote from the hospital, because a lot of people don't know that that is a right they have. So Patient Voting was founded by Kelly Wong, Heidi Preem, who was an emergency medicine resident. And in 2016, she saw her patients in the emergency room trying to leave to go to the polls and vote here in Rhode Island. So obviously, this is something that comes up, and people on the front lines, such as healthcare workers in the emergency room, noticed. And when she started looking into it, she saw that most states have a process called emergency mail-in, emergency absentee, something of that effect, that allows patients to vote after the regular absentee ballot deadline. So I became involved in 2020 as a student. I'm now a medical student, and get to help people vote from the hospital and trying to spread the word that this is a right that people have. So Patient Voting has a website that has information on emergency voting in all 50 states. And last year we merged with VoteER, which does primarily healthcare-based voter registration. They have really cool badges, which I will show you here. So there's a QR code, and healthcare workers can use that during their visits to check patients' voter registration, get them resources on absentee ballots, and then also find out about emergency voting. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So why is this an important topic? There are over 600,000 people on average in the hospital every day in the US. And who ends up in the hospital? lots of people, 83% of people have interaction with a healthcare center every year. But it's especially people experiencing chronic illness and people living with disabilities who end up in the hospital more frequently and for longer periods of time. And a study from Georgetown found that low-income citizens in poor health are around 10% more likely to cite their sickness as an impediment to voting compared to high-income citizens also in poor health. So that's part of the reason I'm here talking to you all today. Next slide. So we're really trying to come into this cycle and mobilize healthcare workers to have these conversations about voting. We are also nonpartisan, and that's how we do the work we do. That's how we get approval from hospital administrators when that's necessary. And this cycle feeds into itself, and we can create a positive feedback loop. Next slide. And we have seen success, as probably many of you know. People are more likely to turn out to vote if they are contacted by a nonprofit institution such as this. And then also, people trust healthcare workers, and that's what makes this field an effective touch point to mobilize, because a trusted profession giving them all sorts of health advice, people will trust them when they are explaining the connection between health and voting and how voting can influence things like local politics, school districts, local environments that do have an impact on health. Next slide. So how does emergency voting usually work? It is kind of complicated when you look at all 50 states, but narrowing it down to a general process here. The patient is hospitalized. They then complete an emergency absentee ballot application. We can help by printing applications when they're available and just letting people know that that is an option for them. Then the application has to be delivered to a local board of elections. In some states, it's called a local board of canvassers. And in a lot of states, volunteers can serve as agents to do that, and they can shuttle that application to the board of elections. Then the board of elections gives the ballot back to the patient either through a bipartisan delivery team or back with that same agent. Sometimes the agent also has to be a family member. That varies by state. You can find all that information on patientvoting.com. And then the patient can vote and, yes, exercise that right. And then the ballot is returned either by the bipartisan delivery team, if there's time, by mail, but usually there's not time. Even though they list that as an option, we try and think realistically about timelines here. And then sometimes that agent can also drop the ballot back off. Next slide. Oh yeah, these arrows, you can keep clicking, are just where we can help out as an agent. Okay, next. So this is just a bit of the variation we see. These are just, we collect 50 variables of things like deadlines, who can handle the applications. If this process applies to people other than the patient, in some states, it also applies to caregivers. It could apply to healthcare workers. Emergency voting could also apply to anyone who missed the regular absentee ballot deadline. So it's important for everyone to know about this process. Next slide. And this is just an example because I'm in Rhode Island. Rhode Island has a very long emergency voting period because their absentee ballots are due kind of early. So it begins October 15th here. The application is due the day before the election at 4 p.m. And then the ballot itself is due at 8 p.m. on election day. And what's really cool in Rhode Island is anyone qualifies for an emergency ballot. You don't need to be hospitalized. You could use it if you're ill at home, and you could also use it if you're stuck at work or anything like that. and the forms are easily available on the website, which is not true in every state. Next slide. Here are just a few states where anyone can use emergency voting. Our website is being updated for the general election from all the primaries in the next 2 days. So if it looks a little funky in the next 2 days, that is why. But here are a few key examples where anyone can use emergency voting. Next slide. And just like to reiterate, if there's pushback on this, that we are allowed to be doing this work because of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which also covers things like the DMV being able to do voter registration. So one tactic I like to use when people are confused or unaware of the legality is I like to say it is similar to how the DMV can register people to vote. We're doing the voter education and get out the vote work with patient voting, and it's nonpartisan, which is key. Next. And I just like to highlight Wisconsin real quick. Wisconsin, we have an organizer from VoteER who made a coalition, including the Wisconsin Elections Commission, and we like to work really closely with Secretary of State's offices and election commissions so that we're communicating. If we're bringing in 200 patient applications, we should let them know. And they are very supportive of our work, I will say, in my experience calling all 50 states about how to vote from the hospital. And Disability Rights Wisconsin, also a great partner, and they have been successful in convincing the Wisconsin Elections Commission to put this information on their website. Not every state has information for hospitalized voters on their website. Next slide. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening to me speak about this topic. And if you walk away with anything, just know that you can vote from the hospital. It's possible. And in 38 states, there's a specialized process called emergency voting, some permutation of that, that allows you to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We really appreciate all of your knowledge and leadership and the time you've taken to present this information to our network. I personally didn't know anything about patient voting procedures until we connected, so I just really appreciate all of this knowledge. I see some questions and comments for you coming in the chat, so we will circle back to those after Amira's presentation to take questions for all three of our panelists. And I encourage people to keep putting comments in the chat and directing your questions to the Q&A because it'll make it easier to pull those out. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Amira.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Hi, everyone. I'm Amira Noman. I'm the Executive Director for Pizza to the Polls. I am based in Los Angeles. We are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit that was created in 2016, initially to feed people who are waiting in long lines to vote for free. Our flagship program is called the On Demand platform, where we feed anyone and everyone around a polling location, regardless of if they're voting or not, if they're a poll worker, they're just passing by. This program is actually available in all 50 states. So regardless of what town or city you're in, you can make a report to our website at polls.pizza. And once it's vetted by our volunteers, we'll send in our pizza. So we primarily work with Slice. This is an independent pizzeria platform, which allows us to connect with tens of thousands of local pizzerias around the country. And when Slice is unavailable, we go to like a larger chain. We also send donuts in the morning for those who are waiting in long lines to vote prior to pizzerias being open. In 2022, we created our food truck program. This was in response to the pandemic. We did not know if we could safely get pizzas to long lines. We wanted to be able to provide alternatives with individually wrapped snacks. So that program in 2020 operated in 29 cities across the country with 78 trucks on the road between early voting and election day. That was a partnership that we had with Uber Eats, and it allowed us to have a large amount of variety, whether it was like hot food or shelf-stable snacks and drinks that we could customize based on cities. So say, for example, you were in Nashville, you could also get hot chicken, or if you were in New York City, you could get Emmy squared pizza. So there was a lot of variety, and it allowed us to like really tap into every city that we were into. It also really allowed us to pivot quickly as we would get these reports of the long lines. So we could send the trucks in, and we could also be in compliance with a lot of these newly formed laws. So for example, in Georgia, there's SB 202, so we can no longer deliver directly to the lines, but the trucks help us still be in compliance and be outside of the polling bubble and serve folks who are waiting in those lines. In 2020 alone, we were able to put over $1 million directly into independent pizzerias. That's something we're really proud of, as so many businesses were on the verge of closing during the pandemic. And kind of continuing on that route in 2021, we noticed that lines were starting to form at some key vaccination sites for COVID-19. So we created a program called Vax and Snacks, and that allowed us to feed people who are in those lines, specifically in Georgia, South Carolina, and California. And we partnered with CORE, which is the relief agency, as well as Slice Again and Wetzel's Pretzels, to make sure that we fed folks who are in those lines and to support them as they were getting vaccines. We created one more program in 2022 called the Pre-Order Program, and that allows us to partner with other nonpartisan nonprofits that are really working year-round. So whether they're in the voter registration space, education, or turnout, we send pizzas directly to those events throughout the year. That allows us to really get to know groups that are on the ground, whether they're serving maybe a population that's experiencing food insecurity, or high school students that are learning about civic engagement for the first time. An example is tomorrow we have over 100 events with student athletes around the country, and that's in partnership with the team. And they engage student athletes like year round as they register to vote and turn out each election season. Also in 2022, we created a community college program, and that was in partnership with Levi's, which we continue to this day, where we send our custom wrap trucks with snacks and pizzas to community colleges around the country, encouraging them to vote, register to vote, vote early. We realized that a lot of the community college students were lagging behind their four-year counterparts in terms of registering to vote, and they tend to stay in their communities after graduation. So they're a very important demographic to engage and support in their civic engagement journey. So this year, we will continue all of those same programs, whether people are registering to vote or voting early, or encouraging others to do the same. We want to make sure that we can feed people for free as they're doing that. To date, we have sent over 1.5 million snacks around the country with all of these programs. We have serviced nearly 5,000 individual polling states and 49 states. We will close the loop on our very last state this year, which is Vermont. They tend not to have long lines. So we're doing a special partnership with the state on election day this year. Oh, I appreciate you putting all the stats up. We have so many, so I want to make sure that I can answer all this information at the end through the Q&A as well, and how we can all partner together. But our main goal really at Pizza to the Polls is to make sure that people feel like they are supported as they're going out to vote, whether, feeling like this is actually something fun and it's not a chore. It's not like going to the DMV, that if we provide free food, we can show people that we really appreciate their efforts and that we're making democracy fun again. So I look forward to getting some questions for you all. I can share some toolkits and share information on how we can partner with each of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amira. And yeah, we're seeing a lot of interest in sending some pizzas to people's local communities. So I'm sure you will be getting a lot of follow-up, and appreciate you sharing all the information about how to get in touch. So I'll invite all of our panelists to come back on. I know we're getting a lot of fantastic questions for all of you. So I'll just pose those questions. Some of them are kind of directed specifically, and some of them, if you feel like jumping in, you can definitely do so. One question for Amira. Does your program consider people who are gluten-free, or are there inclusivity for people with other dietary restrictions?
When we have, most of it comes down to funding. So when we have the funding, we always send plain pizzas, we send vegetarian, gluten-free. We also try and customize to cities. So say you're in Detroit and you want Detroit style pizza, or certain toppings that are like key to certain cities. When we have the funding for that, we absolutely always do that. That was a huge thing in 2020 is we made sure to send many different options. And when there isn't quite as much funding, because obviously inflation, pizzas are a lot more expensive than they used to be, and we really pride ourselves on also tipping the delivery drivers very well. Then we usually do more plain, but we do try our best to make sure we can accommodate for dietary restrictions. And if we're doing pre-order with specific groups on the ground, then we can definitely take in those considerations.
Fantastic. That's great to know. And I just love the kind of dual focus on both empowering and protecting the vote, and also supporting local businesses. That's just such a fantastic model. Kind of on that note, someone asked a question about embedding into websites for local food trucks. So do you kind of have like any cross promotion from local businesses? Like, do the local businesses that you're partnering with do anything to encourage voting as well?
Occasionally, but we generally, when we do our training with like staff that are on the truck, we try and just keep it about the food because like in our work, it's very easy to get partisan accidentally. And so we really try and just make it about the snacks. And then someone on our team, if they're on the ground, can give more information about voting.
That makes sense. Yeah, kind of keeping it to the trusted partners who are trained in this work. Um, I see a question, really great question about encouraging low-income renters in our community to increase registration and turnout, and specifically how to engage low-income renters in doing this work, which is a big priority for us at Our Homes, Our Votes. So could any of you speak to the ways that you engage directly impacted people and kind of being trusted messengers and getting their community members out to vote?
Yeah, I can share. So I'm excited to share about Ohoashe, our national voting rights campaign, where we're actively recruiting poll monitors. I think one of my personal beefs as an organizer is asking people to do volunteer work without compensating them for their time. So we are offering $50 stipends to poll monitors that will be volunteering with us. And I just think that across the board, equity is definitely imperative with access and making sure that folks are, like I said, compensated for their time. Folks that are volunteering have to evaluate childcare. They have to evaluate maybe even time off that they will be in the field. So that's something that we definitely try to meet our volunteers in the middle with our stipends for their time.
Thank you. That's so core to what we believe in at NLIHC and Our Homes, Our Votes, in terms of making sure that people who are not being paid a salary for doing this work are compensated just like those of us who are, because everyone's time and expertise is valuable. Really appreciate that.
I can speak to that a little too. Since merging with VOTER, we've been able to have a grant program for community health centers, federally qualified health centers, giving them $5,000 to $10,000 to implement some of the voter registration and get out the vote tools like patient voting and emergency voting. And community health workers are really some of the most effective people in the healthcare profession to get this information out because they are often from the communities they're serving. So yeah, focusing our efforts on that has been really exciting this year.
Thanks, Nicole. Kind of a related question that we got in the chat about people who maybe are experiencing a crisis in the hospital and may not, or maybe kind of like turned off by messaging about voting. So how do you navigate that tension between like people who may not, prioritize voting in that crisis moment, and the fact that, people want to make their voices heard and these procedures are available to them? What kind of messaging and outreach do you do to kind of earn people's trust?
Absolutely. Yeah, we are never forcing anyone to vote. It's more posed as a resource, and a lot of times we try and make this an option in waiting rooms and other places where people are already filling out a lot of paperwork and unfortunately experiencing long wait times. So, yeah, if someone is in critical condition, we are not going to be asking them about if they are registered to vote and if they want to vote. This is something we're trying to work into hospitals and health centers with appropriate appropriateness. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I see you shared in the chat, but I'm not sure that everyone can see this response about the specifics from states. Would you mind just kind of elevating that for the full group?
Yes, we had a question about different kinds of disabilities and how voting works for that. And so I would recommend going to the National Disability Rights Network resources and also local chapters of that, because it does vary a lot state to state how voting with both mental and physical disabilities, like who's qualified and the support resources for that state to state. And also the like if you're formerly incarcerated, you sometimes have to like re-enter the polls, and there are a lot of specifics with that that patient voting also does not cover on our website. What were the other parts of that question? Oh, and nursing homes and long-term care facilities often have, I'd say, less of an emergency response, and there's opportunities to plan voting opportunities for folks in those places in advance. Often they send kind of like a multi-partisan assistance team and then set up voting there for people.
Great. That's a great point. We got a question about the role of 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofits and what they can do to assist people in hospitals without crossing any lines. So I think raises a great point. How can people on this call in a nonpartisan way get involved with patient voting and support people who may be hospitalized in exercising their right to vote? And we can speak to that a little bit from the Our Homes, Our Votes perspective. Being here, you're a trusted messenger in your community. Everyone here is really passionate about voting, but a lot of friends and neighbors may be either skeptical about participating in the process, or not sure how to make a voting plan and navigate the logistics of voting. So really just talking to your neighbors, or if you work for a 501c3 nonprofit that directly serves a community, make that information about voting available, as long as you're not doing these activities in a way that benefits a certain candidate or political party or tries to convince people to vote for a candidate or political party. Helping people make a plan to vote is completely nonpartisan. Encouraging voter turnout is completely nonpartisan. And we have a lot of resources on the Our Homes, Our Votes website that can guide you through doing this. I'm also seeing Camilla raise her hand, so I'll pass it over to Camilla to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that this question cross applies perfectly to our hotline 866-OUR-VOTE. Voters who are in hospitals or even in jail, right, all deserve the right and the access to be able to have their questions answered. I would hate to see a scenario where a nurse, right, or someone who might help run the jail might disenfranchise a voter and tell them that they don't have the rights that they do have. So 866-OUR-VOTE is a resource for any and everywhere for voters to address these concerns and ask these questions. And I'll cross-apply that to the last question about voter apathy. I think it's very important for us in this work, specifically voting rights work, to lean into voter apathy and understand that voters who are system impacted and voters who have health problems have every reason to be critical and hesitant about engaging with our electoral process. We, as people doing this work, we have a duty to restore that autonomy and that power and engage with voters and help them understand that every question that they have is a relevant and necessary question or concern. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about both those questions.
Thanks, Camilla. And we always talk about how housing is always on the ballot. Elections at every level will have an impact for housing justice. And so for those of us who are involved in mobilizing renters or are directly impacted renters, we know that the issues on the ballot are directly affecting our communities, and making sure that we make our voices heard on the policies that will govern our own lives is really, really critical. I'm seeing some more good questions. We got a question about a notary for patient voting. Nicole, are there states that require a notary?
Yes, and they are decreasing. For the example of Rhode Island, a notary was required in um, before 2020, and then they changed that law because of COVID. It's hard enough to vote, and getting a notary in COVID, I mean, just imagine. And that change has stuck, so now we don't need a notary anymore. But most places, it's a notary or two witnesses that do have that requirement, but it's not too many states anymore.
Great, thank you, and love to hear when voting laws become more accessible, especially when that's happened in the wake of COVID and people realizing actually we can make a lot of these changes permanent. There's no reason why voting needs to face why there need to be so many obstacles to voting. Um, I see a question about can people with permanent resident status vote? To vote in federal elections and nearly all state and local elections, you must be a US citizen. There are a handful of places that are allowing for immigrants to vote in local elections, but it's a very small, select number of places. There also, though, I would say that voting isn't the only way to be civically engaged. So people who are permanent residents who don't have citizenship can certainly engage in advocacy, and activism. There are many other ways to get involved in the democratic process. Great question about kind of very relevant to current events. And I know many people in our network are directly impacted by the current hurricanes. So are any of your organizations working in disaster impacted areas? And is there anything in particular that you're doing in this moment to support people who may face increased obstacles to voting due to the hurricanes?
VoteER has some specific organizers, for example, in North Carolina. So I'm not privy to what exactly is happening there, but we do have on the ground organizers. And so that is how we are, yeah, coping at the moment.
Thanks, Nicole. And if you're someone who's in an area that's affected by disasters, if you're in North Carolina, please reach out to us. We have a disaster housing recovery coalition that is really active, working with partners on the ground, can certainly get you connected with resources there. I'm seeing a great question in the chat about AI. Camilla, is there anything that the Lawyers Committee and the Election Protection Hotline are doing specifically to respond to AI and its role in elections?
Absolutely, yes. AI is something that we are definitely equipping ourselves with combating for this general election. 866 our vote. We are, well, first of all, we definitely offer trainings to our hotline volunteers on how to receive and respond to certain complaints of AI disinformation. But really, we pride ourselves and take a goal in making sure that the hotline is advertised digitally as much as possible. So voters who are encountering AI issues are reporting that in real time to the hotline. Since early voting has started, we have seen a very high call volume percentage specifically pertaining to AI. So we're actually working very closely with the Department of Justice, as well as making sure that our legal attorneys are up to date on any AI specific legislation that are coming to play in their specific states. But really the biggest thing is making sure that the hotline is a resource and encouraging voters to report any disinformation that they may be experiencing with AI, because I don't think what a lot of people understand is that AI can be synonymous with voter disinformation, right? So AI can be a literal form of making sure that ensuring that a voter is discouraged or dissuaded from pertinent information to their polling location or their county. So yeah, just making sure that this hotline is broadcasted as much as possible.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. We got another question about funding opportunities, and specifically for survivors of domestic violence. Are there anything that your organizations do specifically to empower survivors of domestic violence to vote? We can also look into that further and share more resources on a future webinar. I know there's a lot of specific sensitivities around privacy and making sure that survivors can balance their privacy rights with their right to participate in the political process. So that's something we can share more resources about in a future week. And then we also had some questions about funding opportunities more generally. I know that we're kind of, very close to the election and voting is underway, so there may not be funding opportunities available right now. But do any of your organizations have funding opportunities that people should look out for in future election cycles?
So as I mentioned before, VOTER does have a grant program for federally qualified healthcare centers. I would expect the next cycle would be leading up to the midterms in 2022. But who knows, there could be one before that as well. And they will probably give preference to certain states based on what's on the ballot and if things impacting health specifically are on the ballot.
Great, thank you so much. I also see a comment in the chat about registering for your state's address confidentiality program for survivors of domestic violence, which is a really important resource to know about. One more question that I see in the Q&A is about sharing this information on social media platforms. And absolutely, we encourage you to share all of this, share information about the election protection hotline, about patient voting, about Pizza to the Polls. I know we've put social media links and websites in the chat for a few organizations. I think we could drop those in the chat one more time. I'll also include them in the follow-up notes. Please follow all of these organizations and share their resources widely. So we have like 3 minutes left. I have some few closing announcements, so I'm gonna jump right into that. Thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time to speak during this incredibly hectic election season. I appreciate all of the work that you're doing day in and day out, and just all of the resources that you're sharing with our network. So just to jump into some closing announcements, today is actually the first day of National Voter Education Week. This is a nonpartisan week of action to celebrate our democracy and ensure that all voters are prepared to cast their ballots with confidence. We'll drop a link in the chat to learn more about National Voter Education Week. And this week is structured around 5 calls to action. The first is registering to vote. The second is getting to know your ballot. The third is making a plan to vote. The fourth is understanding the process. And the fifth is sharing with friends and family. I recommend keeping an eye out on the Our Homes, Our Votes social media platforms for a week-long tweet chat. We'll be partnering with the National Alliance to End Homelessness to answer some FAQs about voting and share some resources out. We can go to the next slide. So seeing as today's call to action is registering to vote, I encourage everyone to take a minute to check their registration status and sign up for election reminders on TurboVote, which is our online voter registration and information portal. You can find it by scanning the QR code on the slide or checking the link that we'll share in the chat. Now, if you've already confirmed that you're registered to vote, you know 100% that you're registered at your current address. Send this link to 3 friends or family members so they can do the same on this first day of National Voter Education Week. We can go to the next slide. We are getting close to the end of our webinar series, but we do still have 3 more. The next webinar will take place on Monday, October 21st, and it will focus on the theme of getting out the vote in this kind of last few weeks push before Election Day. And we can go to the next slide. So you can find a full description of that webinar as well as previews of all of the upcoming webinars at the webinars link that we will share in the chat on the Our Homes, Our Votes website. We can go to the next slide. Last but not least, I will just share that we have our Homes, Our Votes network of affiliates. I know that many of you are already a part of it. If you aren't already a member of the affiliates network, I highly encourage you to join. This is open to any nonpartisan organization that's committed to carrying out the goals of this campaign. We have a listserv for affiliates where we share announcements about opportunities related to nonpartisan voter engagement. We have regular office hours, and there's some enhanced access to Our Homes, Our Votes tools and resources for affiliates. So we'll drop that link in the chat as well. I'm seeing one more question about getting a link. Absolutely. We will share this all in our Friday email newsletter, The Connection, and it'll be up on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. So please spread the word. All of this information is meant to be shared. Um, and I think that brings us to the close. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists for being here. And we're looking forward to keeping in touch and continuing to collaborate throughout this election season and beyond. Thanks, everyone.